A Stroke of Genius by Thomas Thursday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braymiller. A Stroke of Genius by Thomas Thursday. Those chaps, Samuel Langhorne Barker and Ellis Butler Swain, are just as humorous as a coal famine. Why, when I read Barker's Finnish Huckleberries, all that I needed to make me cry was a little soft music and some low lights. And say, every time I think of Swain's Pigs as Pork, I get as weepy as a 2-weeks-old widow. And the public eats so much of that stuff that they get indigestion of the brain and wonder what's the matter with them. Why, they tell me that the editors just wear out their auto tires chasing after those fellows. I tell you, Jim, the only way for a new writer to get a story published nowadays is either to buy a magazine outright or marry the editor's pet stenographer. Believe me, I never brag, but you know yourself that my stories have got that bunch of millionaire scribes beaten to a fare-you-well. This explosive criticism occurred one night while Jeff and I were furnished rooming together out in Clevelado, Calachusetts. Regular pals, you know. Wore each other's shirts, socks, suits, and during hard times took turns at the overcoat. At that time we were both employed in the assembling department of the Irrational Crookometer Company. The salary to start was $12.50 per, and apparently it was about the same to finish. We had been working there for nearly a year, but up to that time the firm had not even raised a window. Jeff, being the more ambitious of the two, decided to write humorous stories for the magazines. Being a failure at almost everything else, he figured that he ought to be a whirlwind at the writing game. Wasn't that the way most of the big guns of the profession started? He believed it was. Otherwise, he couldn't account for the successful authors. I, of course, was perfectly willing to listen to his assorted ravings, which was almost as tedious as composing them. Desirous of starting business in the proper literary fashion, we purchased a typewriter on the Chatham plan. $1 down and 2 bell rings per week. Jeff, his full name was Jefferson, named after the famous Thomas, you know, wasted a ream of perfectly good bond paper in his efforts to master the vagaries of the keyboard. Bill for said wastage amounting to $1.10. However, after about 3 months' practice, he managed to typewrite in a semi-readable manner 3 of his best literary efforts. They were The Learned Lunatic, The Speed of a Snail, and The Strength of Senator Garlick. Rest assured we read and reread, polished and repolished that trinity of literary gems from every possible angle. We would pet them at breakfast, hug them at lunch, and use them as dessert at dinner. How could any editor, possessing at least a spoonful of brains, reject such rare humor? Not a chance in the world. We had visions of smoke tanks, divisions of gold, and revisions of our living habits, all rolled up into one glorious nightmare. 2. Our next move was to discover the hiding place of the nearest magazine, owing to the new postage rates. To get the proper address of such periodicals, we delved into the mysteries of Jeff's newly acquired book entitled 1,000 Places to Sell Stories, or Why Work for a Living? On page 23 we were pleased to learn that one of the largest magazines in the country, the Flipperino Weekly, was published right here in Clevelado. Fine. Under such favorable conditions, Jeff figured that if the editor dared to purloin or plagiarize his pearly masterpieces, he could easily dash around to the office and declare war. Wasn't he, at one time, a special officer in a baseball park? He surely was. That evening the 3 stories were mailed to the unsuspecting editor of the Flipperino Weekly. Neither of us got much sleep that night. About 3 a.m., Jeff, who had been silent for at least 15 minutes, poked me in the ribs, wishing to know what we were going to do about the motion picture rights. Would the editor get all the gravy? What would the MP folks pay for stories like his? Raved out, Jeff finally passed into the land of restless dreams. 3. Didn't I tell you that a new writer doesn't stand a chance of charging through an editor's barbed wire entanglements? That's all the thanks a fellow gets for writing stories that appeal to the people instead of some dyspeptic editor. You guessed it. The gems came back, and Jeff was just as peeved as a tailless cow trying to chase hungry flies off her back. The editor, however, was not altogether heartless, for he requested Jeff to revise the Senator Garlic yarn and submit it again. "Can you imagine a goop like that?" raved Jeff, quivering like a bowl of gelatin on an old-fashioned ferry boat. "He picks out the worst of the three and wants it revised." "What'll we do about it, Jim?" he asked, calming down about 20 degrees. "Just what the editor requests," I replied emphatically. Personally, I figured that a nibble was just as good as a catch, provided the hook was baited in the proper manner on the next cast-out. Anyway, it showed that there were fish in the editorial waters somewhere, and all it required to hook them was a little patience on Jeff's part. "It's a mystery to me why he selected that garlic story," continued Jeff. "The other two were hummers, believe me. Well, you see what boobs get the editorial jobs." 4. During the next few days, Jeff and I disguised the strength of Senator Garlic in such a way that we didn't recognize it after the job of revision was done. Jeff's method of promoting thought was to pace up and down the room like a candidate awaiting election returns. He had read somewhere that Robert Louis Stevedore and Arthur Conan Sherlock were inclined to indulge in several choice fits before writing a masterpiece. Jeff was following the approved methods of thought stimulus all right, and it would not be his fault if The Strength of Senator Garlic didn't appeal strongly enough now to the mind of the editor. "What do the Flipperino people pay for a 3,000-word story?" inquired Jeff, sticking the pen behind his ear. "About 2 cents a word to new writers, I guess," I replied. 2 cents, eh? Well now, let's see. That would land us 60 bones, wouldn't it? Yep. "Say, Jim, can't we stretch Senator Garlic into $500? Asked the enterprising Jeff. "Certainly not. You can't turn a short story into a 300-page novel," I answered impatiently. "I can't, eh? I guess you don't read some of the best-sellers, Jim. Why, some of those bathrobed scribes can write a 400-page novel in such a manner that you couldn't find enough plot in it to make a decent short story. Fellows like that ought to come under federal supervision during wartime for wasting paper and good ink. And the funny thing about it is that all the factory fannies, Stella Stenogs, and Candy Carries go plumb nutty over such stuff." Jeff punctuated his remarks with hands, legs, and arms, without serious injury to the mirror. "Why, every time some poor dub of a boss leaves his office for a little liquid refreshment, the girls yank out a George Starr Cushion's latest sob entitled The Frozen Tear of Texas and forget all about the boss's interest. Jim, if it wasn't for the dear girls, about 90% of those writers would have to go back to the factory and don overalls." "Stop knocking, Jeff," I chirped. "They get away with it, don't they? And they own motors and live in swell hotels. Give 'em credit." "Credit beans," grunted he, turning to finish the revision of his story. 5. The following morning, on our way to the factory, we mailed the revised manuscript. Jeff whistled various popular and unpopular tunes during working hours, as he felt assured that he would soon be able to tell the manager to hire a new boy. The rest of the fellows couldn't understand what had come over Jeff, because hitherto he had been the prize grouch of the shop. Saturday night he came near quitting the job. He figured that he would soon receive a check for $60, which would put him on velvet until he could write his next masterpiece. Luckily, I persuaded him to wait a while, as jobs were scarce. It was a good thing he heeded my warning, because the same evening a letter from the editor awaited him at home. It read like this: "Dear Mr. Sweeney, you will be pleased to learn that your story, The Strength of Senator Garlic, has been accepted by this magazine and will appear in an early issue. Enclosed we send you check for $2.50, which sum is our regular rate of payment for a story like yours. I trust that you will become a regular contributor from now on. Yours sincerely, Hicks Baldome, Editor." Well, sir, or ma'am, when Jeff got the full gist of that editorial bullet into his sensitive and vainglorious noodle, I thought that he'd require the service of a straitjacket. "Get a cop!" he howled, pacing up and down like a New York thermometer. "What does that goop think I live on? Donut holes and air wafers?" "Take it easy, Jeff. Maybe the editor made a mistake," I said soothingly. "Mistake?" he glared. "I should say he did make a mistake." No sleep that night. Jeff tossed around like a Mexican jumping bean and growled intermittently in a most uncanny manner. Poor Jeff. He was all in. 6. On the level, Jim, don't you think my story outshines all the rest of that sickly-looking bunch in this magazine? Asked Jeff, passing me the latest issue of the Flipperino Weekly, which contained his story. To be perfectly candid, Jeff's yarn did loom up far ahead of all the rest, and I told him so. Say, I've got an idea that will make that editor feel as cheap as a dime in front of a barrel of sugar, he said confidently. Shoot, was my request. Listen, he began. We'll frame up some fake letters of praise and send them to our friends in different parts of the country. The scheme is to have them rewrite them and send them to the editor signing their own name. Some idea, eh? I agreed that it was a corker, if it worked. Now, I learned in after life that letters of praise to an editor are just as welcome as a revolution to a grade-A Bolshevikist. Such epistles, you understand, are a means that a poor editor has of knowing the pulse of his clientele. But the letters often rub the editorial fur in the wrong direction. Perchance the editor will receive 500 letters praising a certain story, and one howling that said story was hopelessly bad. Then it's a 10-to-1 shot that the editor will agree with the minority communication. Letters are bully things for the editor, but let the author beware. Neither Jeff nor I understood editorial psychology at that time. 7. During the next half-hour Jeff busied himself with the frame-up letters. The composing of them delighted him to the core. He was at his very best when it came to the manufacture of fairy tales. Have a slant at this, Jim, he said as he passed me one of the finished letters. It read as follows. Henry Vermain, December 5, 1917. Editor, Flipperino Weekly, Cleveland, Massachusetts. Sir, allow me to congratulate you on selecting a real story at last. The Strength of Senator Garlic was the best yarn your bone-dry magazine has ever published. Give us some more stories by Jefferson Sweeney. He's a genius. Yours truly, P.O. Box 1861, Hiram Fluke. It's a little raw, Jeff, isn't it? I said. Raw, your grandmother. I'd put a bomb into each one if I could. Read the rest. That the reader may have the benefit of Jeff's genius, I'll give 2 more complete samples. Fishhook, Floralina, December 7, 1917. Editor, Flipperino Weekly, Cleveland, Massachusetts. Dear Sir, has the magazine changed hands recently? It certainly looks that way because I found a live story in your last issue. Prior to this number, all the stories appeared to me as if the writers had dyspepsia or rheumatism of the brain. If you wish to have your magazine continue to have a healthy circulation in these parts, why, you'd better give Jefferson Sweeney a contract for life. His garlic story was so comical that my ever-hungry brother postponed his breakfast to read it. Yours for the change. P.O. Box 1770. Maud Chewing. Here's the other. Take a look, Washington, December 4, 1917. Ed. Flipperino Weekly, Cleveland, Massachusetts. Dear Ed, when I read The Strength of Senator Garlic by Jefferson Sweeney in your last issue, I was obliged to turn to the title page to see if it was the same magazine. Well, 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 you woke up at last. Why, heretofore your stories were so sad that our minister used to take them for his Sunday sermon text. Now, if you will promise to give us some more of Mr. Sweeney's tales, I will take a year's subscription and pay for it out of my own pocket this time. The present subscription was a Christmas present given to me by a veteran of the Civil War. Yours sincerely, P.O. Box 1492, Philip O'Can. 8. I'll be back in a few minutes, Jim. Just going over to the post office and mail the letters, said Jeff, putting on his cap and overcoat. How many are you going to send? I asked. 7 this time. More in a few days, he replied as he breezed out of the room. Left alone, I tried to vision the learned editor's conduct after reading Jeff's strategical correspondence. I couldn't imagine that gentleman otherwise than taking it all to heart and immediately forwarding Jeff a life contract. 15 minutes later, Jeff returned, excited and out of breath. "Did I leave one of the letters here?" he asked, panting. "I don't see it," I replied after searching around the room. "Well, I bought stamps for 7, but when I started to stick them on, I discovered that one letter was missing." "Maybe you lost it. Whom was it addressed to?" "To an old friend, Tom Kelly, out in Florafina, Merriwear," he answered, scratching his head. "It'll be all right, I guess. Possibly some conscientious person may find it, stick on a stamp, and shoot it into the mailbox," I remarked philosophically. For the next few weeks Jeff promenaded around with one of those "don't touch me, I'm holy" walks, figuring on the blessed day when he would be able to discard his overalls forever. And of course I humored him in his whim, believing that eventually I would be the same to him as Monsieur Bourrienne was to Napoleon Bonaparte. Knowing somewhat of the life of Jack London and Oliver Goldsmith, I was imaginative enough to dream that Jeff was capable of attaining the same literary eminence. Wasn't he struggling for recognition in much the same manner as those chaps? He surely was, in my opinion. 9. "Looks like another letter from the editor," I remarked one evening as we entered the house. "That's the stuff," said Jeff as we dashed up to the room. "I'll bet it's a contract," said I enthusiastically. "Oh boy, it's the bacon all right," was his joyous return. "Bet you can't leave it on the desk 5 minutes without opening it," I said. "No bet. I'm going to open that letter just as soon as I take my mitts off," he answered excitedly. "Well, sir," or "ma'am." When Jeff read that epistle of supposed to be joy, he changed so much that he wouldn't have had a chance to pass the physical examination of a wooden army. "The game's up," he gasped, dropping into a chair. "What's the matter? Bad news?" I asked solicitously. "Worse than that. Something went wrong. Read it for yourself." I did. Surely it was a 24-carat knockout wallop. Listen to the innocent editor. "Mr. Jefferson Sweeney, 13 Luck Avenue, Clevelado, Calachusetts. Dear Mr. Sweeney, I take this opportunity of informing you that I would be pleased to give you a life contract, provided, of course, that your future stories are guaranteed to be just half as humorous as your art and method of correspondence. No offense, please. Yours pleasantly, Hicks Baldome, Editor." What is your guess? That the editor found Jeff's lost letter? Something like that. He did not find it, but the office boy did. How could he? Too easy. The office boy lived next door to us, it turned out upon investigation. Did he open it? Oh, boy. And did he hotfoot to the editor with it? He did. Tough luck? It was. My, but you are a good guesser. End of A Stroke of Genius. Nearly Over by Thomas Thursday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braemiller. Nearly Over by Thomas Thursday. A setback only had the effect of making Sweeney try harder than ever to smash into print with one of his marvelous stories. In fact, after his distasteful work was finished for the day at the Crookometer factory, he would dash back to the room and proceed to hatch out new plots by the score. No trouble at all. He became also an expert typewriter player, and, after only 6 months' practice, managed to reel off a full sheet of paper without making more than 10 or 15 mistakes. Not bad, eh? Of course, you must bear in mind that Jeff used only 2 fingers, one on each hand, while other stenogs had to use all. He assured me that he had the new noiseless touch system down pat. But, unfortunately, the goop that camped in the next room didn't appreciate the noiseless part of the system, because one night he shouted through the keyhole, "Why don't you guys bring up a hand organ? I'm tired of hearing that pile-driving machine of yours. Play on something else for a change." Jeff paid no attention to the poor chap's raving, and kept right on banging away until he had finished his new story. And it was some story. Personally, I thought, well, here's what Jeff thinks about it. I'll admit, Jim, that in writing The Mender of Broken Hearts, I'm catering to the taste and appetites of girls under 20 and those over 40. But we can use a little coin, can't we? I figured it all out, and I'm dead sure that I've written one of the greatest mush stories ever attempted. It's on the style of that guy Harold Ding Dong Left, and there's enough tears in it to promote a miniature ocean, believe me. You know that I don't care to lower myself to scribble stuff like that. But since 90% of the girls are not happy unless they have something to cry over, far be it from me to stop them enjoying themselves. What magazine do you think will pay the highest price for it, Jim? I'd advise you to shoot it to the Eversob Monthly. That's just about their speed, I think. How much do they slip you? I don't know, Jeff. They ought to pay at least 2 cents a word for a story like that. It's a novelette, isn't it? Yeah, I guess you could call it that and get away with it. It's about 100 typewritten pages, and there's a little over 25,000 words mixed up in it. What's the difference between a novelette and a novel, Jeff? Well, in my opinion, Jim, novelettes are always started with the idea of writing a novel, but the goop that's writing it runs dry in the middle. The only thing he can do then is throw in some kind of reasonable finish and label it novelette. And what would you call a novel? As a rule, a novel is a thin short story that's fattened with about 60,000 words used in the descriptions of trees, moonlight, and the hair of the leading dame. Then what's a short story? That's a cinch to answer. A short story is nothing but the scenario of a novel. Jeff yawned a little and made arrangement to place his feet in a more comfortable position upon the bureau. By the way, Jeff, Mrs. Snickers told me this morning that the typewriter man was around looking for some dough, I said, changing the subject. Well, he'll get paid just as soon as some of those dyspeptic editors slip me some coin. It won't be the first bill he's muffed in his lifetime, believe me, he replied in a bored manner. You see, we had purchased a typewriter on the hide-and-seek plan, and Mrs. Snickers, our landlady, told me very politely that she didn't care to have the good name of her boarding house embarrassed by having a choice assortment of installment collectors wear out the doorbell. Say, Jim, where's the Eversob Monthly published? Out in Minicago, Wisconsin, I informed him. Good night. That's extra postage, isn't it? Well, it's only a few cents more, but think of the coin you're going to get for it, I shot back enthusiastically. All right, then. I'll give that bird the first crack at it. And he did. 2 weeks later, the editor of the Eversob Monthly gave Jeff an opportunity to test his lungs in the approved manner. Listen to Jeff. Believe me, Jim, the only thing that separates that editor from a crepe-colored eye is about $15 worth of railroad fare. Take it from me, if that goop had his office here in Clevelado, I'd be in jail long ago. He thinks he's funny, don't he? Well, believe me, the day will come when he'll wear out the knees of his pants begging for some of my stuff. Just wait. Now, if you don't think Jeff was justified in howling like that, read this. My dear Sweeney, your enclosed 100 sheets of paper would have been very acceptable to this magazine, had you left them blank. Yours, etc., Hilary Felix, Editor. On the level. Wouldn't that take the heart out of the Sphinx? How the editor ever muffed the mender of broken hearts is to Jeff the 8th, 9th, and 10th wonder of the world. I say, Jeff, maybe if you read a little more, you'd get what they call style. You know that you don't read much besides the Clevelado Evening Guesser, I told Jeff, trying to help him. Forget it, Jim, forget it. You don't have to know anything to write stories. Why, there isn't one story out of 100 that's printed the way the guy wrote it. That's what an editor's for. And talk about reading. Believe me, Jim, nothing gets by me. Absolutely nothing. Why, I've read all the classics, such as Slick Starter, Old Queen Grady, The Statue Boys of '76, and a bunch of them workin' lose tales. Of course, when I was a young chap and didn't know any better, I used to read lowbrow stuff like Less Misery by that Frenchy fellow, Victor Hugo. I also skimmed over a lot of stuff by those old Greek hack writers like Eris Plato, Sincero, and periodicals. Of course, all that stuff died long ago. Take $20,000 Under the Ocean by Julius Verne, for example. Why, in order to keep that alive, they had to put it out as a moving picture. And say, talk about poetry. Remember that small-time poem by old Jack Milton called Paradise Missing? And that infernal affair by Dante on Theory? Well, I read all that dope before I ever met you, Jim. Now doesn't that prove to you that there's something wrong with a country that allows a genius like Jeff to wear out his young life in a suit of overalls? Although I knew he was pretty well educated and all that, I didn't know that he had waded through all that stuff. By the way, Jeff, when did you leave school? I asked. I didn't leave, Jim. You see, it was this way. I had been going to school for about 2 years when one day the goop that sat next to me dropped his bean shooter on the floor. Well, I swiped the blame thing and decided to practice on the kid sitting directly in front of the teacher. Now, I never was a good shot with a thing like that, so I muffed the kid, and the paper bullet hit the teacher plumb on the nose. I haven't been to school since, Jeff concluded with a faraway look in his eyes. Too bad, I remarked, and it sure was. Poor Jeff was one of those fellows who'd never have any luck anyway. 3 days later he bought 7 of the latest magazines and promptly voiced his disapproval of the bunch. However, when I looked them over, I discovered something that might interest him. Say, Jeff, did you notice that chap, Chauncey Crackers, has one of his stories in all these magazines except the Tenderfoot Weekly? What did you say the goop's name was? Asked he, interested. Crackers, I repeated. Crackers? No wonder the girls eat up his brand of stuff. If I had a name like Crackers, I'd write advertisements for the Leatherine Biscuit Company. Listen, Jim, I've got an idea. Suppose I frame up a story and sign Chauncey Crackers' name to it and shoot it to the editor of the Tenderfoot. I figure that the poor dub will faint from joy when he discovers that Chauncey has lowered himself to send him some of his work. How about it? Great, Jeff, great, I exclaimed enthusiastically. Leave it to Sweeney to frame up the big idea. On the level, isn't he some genius? So far as nerve is concerned, Jeff was still about 10 laps ahead of the Kaiser. During the next few days, he wrote the greatest yarn of his career. 3. Say, Jim, I think we better blow from this camp. That Flossie Hemp dame gets me nervous. Did you hear her chatter at the table tonight? She sounded like one of those new squeak-a-lot talking machines. And there I was trying to scheme up a new plot with that chick tittering like a canary bird. Why, she knocked 20 pounds of good thoughts plumb out of my noodle. She was all right until she got that job with the Fluker department store. But since then I guess she hollers cash in her sleep. It's fierce. Anyway, he went on, I'm getting sick of the grub old lady Snickers is passing out lately. Did you taste that hash? Some mystery, take it from me. I'll bet 10 to 1 that the cat passed it up. I don't mind hooverizing to help win the war, but old Snickers is just a little too patriotic to suit me. What does she take us for? Birds? And say, don't that pickle supply of hers ever run out? I bet if you walked into the dining room at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd find a gang of pickles on the table. She must be Heinz's 57th cousin. If she thinks I'm going to slip her 6 bones a week for stuff like that, she's plumb nutty. Remember the breakfast? Why, there was enough water in the oatmeal to make a good-sized fish feel at home. And listen, did you taste that egg that she passed out? I don't want to knock her or anything like that, but I bet the hen that manufactured that egg of mine died 2 years ago. Take it from me, Jim, I'm through. When it came to criticizing Mrs. Snicker's war-portioned meals, Jeff hit the nail right on the bean. The only time the dear old dame paid any attention to her victims was when they failed to hand her the weekly bankroll. In that event, she would rap gently on the door and converse about the weather until you slipped her the coin. Jeff claims that she makes at least 90% on her original investment. After growling a while longer, Jeff settled on the bed in disgust and placed his feet upon the pillow. Cheer up, Jeff, I said, trying to make him feel better. Just finish your new cracker story and you'll feel great when the coin rolls in. Cheer up, beans, he raved. How can a guy write in a joint like this? Jeff was surely developing a temperament, just like those regular writers. What's the name of the new story? I inquired, trying to get him separated from his grouch. He brightened up at once and replied, I named it The End of Tilly Finish, and it's got a laugh in every line. I'll wind it up just as soon as I can forget about that hash. However, Jeff didn't forget about that hash, because the following day at the Crookometer factory he had a grand smash-up with the superintendent and was promptly fired. But maybe Jeff didn't tell that fellow something on his way out. Oh, boy. When Jeff had finished, the boss looked like nothing ever seen before. Jeff told me about it the same evening. Take it from me, Jim, I'm glad I'm out of it. How can a man like me get along with a bunch of roughnecks that don't know anything about literature? Why, they're so far out of my class they can't even see me when I breeze by. They never heard of guys like Shakespeare and Rudyard Doyle, or any of those fellows. Well, I don't care. I've got enough coin to hold out a month, and I'm going to sit down and write my head off. That's the spirit, Jeff. Even if your coin does run out, I'm still working, you know. I won't forget that, Jim, and when I do get there, you'll be the only guy I'll recognize, believe me. I couldn't help liking Jeff Sweeney. Personally, I wouldn't care if he failed to work for a year. I felt quite sure that it would be only a short time when he would have all the editors winded from chasing after him. Somehow, though, he didn't make a hit with the girls. In fact, Flossie Hemp thought he had some kind of dyspepsia, but I guess she was sore because Jeff didn't fall for her line of beauty. He wasn't a woman-hater or anything like that, but he liked to surround himself with intellectual people. Of course, poor Flossie wasn't guilty of being anything like that. Her vocabulary, consisting of cash, anything else, and thank you, was about all that her brain could handle at the time, but she knew more about chewing gum than the chap that invented it. 4. During the next week Jeff kept himself cooped in the room like a regular hermit. Although he knew all there was to know about the art of story writing, he bought a book entitled How to Write a Short Story, or Scientific Ways of Ducking an Editor's Wastebasket, just to see if the author of the book knew as much about it as he did. According to Sweeney, the author knew 50% less. "How's the book, Jeff?" I inquired. "Fierce," was his terse reply. "The guy that wrote it, Pendennis Hoop, must have got his dope from an iron foundry. It gets me sore when I read stuff like that. The funny part of it is that he never succeeded in having one of his own stories published. Yet he has the nerve to tell other guys just how to do it. Can you imagine that? For example, take Chapter 10 on What Editors Want but Don't Get. Why, if a writer followed those instructions, he'd be placed in the madhouse for safety of the general public. I bet Pendennis is laughing yet over the 2 bones I slipped him. It's a 10-to-1 shot that he's got a picture of Barnum hanging on the wall." It's a wise old bird that can put one over on Jeff Sweeney, I'll tell you. Say, Jeff, how's the new Cracker story getting along? I finished it this morning, Jim, and mailed it to the tenderfoot editor. Before I sent it, I tried it out on Flossie, and what do you suppose happened? Why, the poor female started to cry before she hurdled the 3rd chapter. And I thought I wrote the greatest humorous story on earth. I bet every time she goes to see one of those Charlie Feet comic pictures, she takes along 5 or 6 handkerchiefs to mop up the tears. She's a mystery to me. 5. Now it so happened that the 7th day following the mailing of the Cracker story fell on Friday the 13th, but it didn't fall half as hard as Sweeney. As I entered the house, Mrs. Snickers met me in the hall and nervously informed me that she thought there was something the matter with Jeff, because she heard strange mutterings leaking via the keyhole. Flossie Hemp was quite sure that Mr. Sweeney must have broken the statue of Julius Caesar, as she was very positive that she heard an awful crash that sounded just like pieces of plaster kissing the floor. That was enough to convince me that all was not as it should be up the vicinity of Jefferson Sweeney. I dashed up to the camp and found Jeff pacing up and down the room with his hands behind his back and his hair twisted all over his head. "What's the trouble, Jeff, old boy?" I asked anxiously. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I feel just as lively as Chris Columbus. Get out your guitar, Jim, and play me the Dead March and Saul. Turn the whole world upside down and find out what's on the bottom of it. Go the limit." "But, Jeff, what's the matter?" I pleaded, greatly agitated. "Smatter? Take a slant at the glad news on the table." I walked over to the table and beheld the rejected Cracker's story. Also a letter from the editor of the Tenderfoot Weekly. When I had finished reading that funereal epistle, I felt worse about it, I think, than Jeff did. Here it is, word for word, and gloom for gloom. "Dear whoever you are, I have reported your case to Dr. Slicer of Morgueview Hospital, and he promises to look you up some day this week. In the meantime, I would suggest that you do the best to alleviate your malady by placing ice-cold towels on your head at intervals of 5 minutes. That's what you get for quitting the plumbing business, anyway. Did a pipe or something fall on your head lately? Sincerely yours, Rufus Hector, editor, otherwise known as Chauncey crackers. If, reader, during your travels you chance to find yourself in the little town of Why Not, Delahampshire, step into the City Hall, and you will find the following record. Jefferson Sweeney, born January 13, Friday, 1896, son of Martha and Jerry Sweeney. End of Nearly Over. Words and Music by Thomas Thursday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Braemiller. Words and Music by Thomas Thursday. Chapter 1. Temporarily Unemployed. Take it from me, Jim, there must be something the matter with those song-writing fellows. Why, I bet I could write better songs than they do with my left hand, or even blindfolded in the dark. I pity anybody who's got to sing stuff like that. Of course I'm not knocking, but it's a cinch that they must compose their melodies on a dishpan instead of a piano. I bought a copy of that theatrical magazine called Maudlin Melodia, and believe me, when I read the advertisements of the latest songs, I promptly decided that the song business would go into the hands of the receiver unless I get busy and help them out. On the level, Jim, don't you think I could beat those guys writing songs? Surely, Jeff. Why don't you try? I chirped. I felt certain that my pal and furnished roommate could excel those regular writers, and I was willing to do everything possible to encourage him. Leave it to Jefferson Sweeney to show people the right way to do things. Although the fact that we resided in Mrs. Snicker's boarding house was a severe handicap to Jeff's art, I figured that he would be able to hurdle such minor obstacles with ease. Jeff was temporarily unemployed, but I was perfectly willing to pay his expenses and take general care of him until his volcanic genius erupted into a lava of dividends. The rent extracted by Mrs. Snickers was quite meagre, likewise the portions she slipped us at the table, and since my salary had been raised to a higher altitude at the Cricklemeter factory, I was able to defray both our board bills with comparatively small hardship. Anyway, I believed Jeff to be an excellent investment, and that for every $1 I loaned to him, I would receive 10 or more in return. Although my motive was not of a mercenary nature, Jeff insisted that he would pay me back with compound interest just as soon as the literary world awakened to the fact that he was a veritable scribe. Hitherto he had tried his hand at writing stories for the magazines, with considerable success, so much so that he had succeeded in having 2 of his gems accepted by periodicals so large and prominent that one even claimed a circulation of more than 2,000. The mere fact that he had numerous rejections to his credit was not his fault, but rather another demonstration of the gentry who have a stranglehold on the editorial jobs when they ought to have a toehold in the plumbing business. Jeff says so, and, of course, he ought to know. All of which shows that Jeff's batting average in the literary league was not so bad, especially when you take into consideration the editorial southpaws he was obliged to face. Listen, Jim, continued Jeff, on your way home from work tomorrow, stop in at Duster's bookstore and get me a copy of How to Write a Popular Song, or Making a Fortune Without Brains, by Fuller Scales. I seen it advertised in the magazines, and maybe it will help me with my work. But I guess I know all there is to know about songwriting. You don't have to know much, anyway. How much will the book cost, Jeff? $1.10 net, according to the advertisement. What does net mean, Jeff? I asked. Well, Jim, a net is something they use to catch things in, like fish. But I think it's a little raw when they use it to sell books with, though I admit that I've been caught a good many times myself. Jeff yawned and suggested that we retire for the night, as it was nearing 10 o'clock. Chapter 2. Inspiration and Casey. About 10 minutes after I slid under the sheets, I fell into a much-needed sleep, which was accompanied by a terrible dream. I heard the constant crack of machine guns and numerous rifle shots. Crack, 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 just like that. Then I heard an awful shouting, and awoke to find Jeff pounding away at his typewriter dressed in his pajamas. "What are you shouting about, Jim?" he asked, grinning. "Dreaming?" "What are you trying to do, Jeff? Write songs at 3 a.m.?" "Well, I got a corking idea for a song while I was half asleep, and I thought it would be a good idea to reel it off while it was still fresh in my mind. Did I wake you up?" "I should say you did. I thought that I was somewhere in Flanders hearing machine guns spout, caused by you banging on the typewriter, I guess. I sure was scared." And I was. "Sorry, Jim, but wait until you see the song I just wrote. It's a peacherino, believe me." "What's the title?" I asked drowsily. "It's pretty sad, Jim. I've called it 'When Pitcher McCarthy Hit Casey on the Bean.' Take a slant at it and compare it with the stuff you hear nowadays." Jeff passed me his handiwork. "Here's the chorus. Wanger smashed a single to the right field fence, but the way he stole second was more than immense. Speeder hit a scorcher that knocked Hookus on his ear. You can take it from me, but that crowd did cheer. Then Muffin slams the pill way up near the moon. They didn't find the ball till the next afternoon. We needed only another run to even up the score, and the mob went wild till their voices got sore. The next three men got their base on balls, which made Manager Flipper foam like Niagara Falls. Then Casey strolled to the plate with his bat in his hand, which made all the girls exclaim, 'Say, ain't he grand?' But such a riot of joy ne'er before was seen, when Pitcher McCarthy hit Casey on the bean." "What do you think of it, Jim?" "Pretty good for 3 o'clock in the morning." "But what happened when Mr. Casey was hit by Mr. McCarthy?" I inquired, not able to understand the song's climax. "What do you suppose happens, you poor goop?" snapped Jeff, getting red in the face. "Would you like me to give you a demonstration? Do you mean to tell me that you don't know what happens when a fellow gets cracked on the bean with a baseball? You wouldn't expect him to sing, would you? As far as I know, Jim, he either gets a place on first base or a place in the hospital. Take it from me, if all the people were like you, I'd have to have my songs illustrated." Chapter 3. Tapping Out Harmony. The following evening, as soon as we had finished our meager supply of hash, onions, and near coffee, Jeff asked Flossie Hemp, the star boarderess, if she would assist him to compose a melody to his song. He painted in bright colors the great chance she would have to become rich and famous via the song-writing route. Now, Jeff didn't know one note from the other, so he figured that Flossie would be able to show him a thing or two about extracting harmony from a piano. She was the only person in the house who could get any sound out of Mrs. Snicker's antique instrument, and, needless to say, she was delighted to help Jeff as much as possible. "You see, Miss Hemp," explained Jeff, "all you've got to do is tap out a little harmony to the words I've written, and I'll get some goop that knows something about arranging songs to do the rest. If I sell the song, which I surely will, I'll split 50-50 with you. Of course I can't let you have your name on it, but if it's a hit I'll mention your name to the actresses and actors, telling them that you helped me out. Are you satisfied?" "I don't care about a name, Mr. Sweeney. All I want is the coin. I saw a gorgeous new—" "That's the idea," interrupted Jeff. "You're just like that old Turkish songwriter, Omar Khayyam, who said, 'Take the cash and let the credit blow.' You remember reading that, don't you?" "Can't say as I did," replied Flossie. This didn't surprise me at all, because when a girl has to measure out ribbons all day at Flooker's department store, she hasn't got any time to delve into the squeaks of songwriters, Turkish or otherwise. Flossie started out by doing a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. "Hit that do key harder, Miss Hemp," said Jeff. "It sounds like money." After practicing and guessing for about 2 hours, they succeeded in setting a certain amount of notes to "When Pitcher McCarthy Hit Casey on the Bean." Although Jeff's voice would have been more at home selling fish up an alley, he managed to get within 20 yards or so of Flossie's notes. "This piano must have been used by Pocahontas," he complained. "It doesn't seem to harmonize with my voice at all." "Well, my old music teacher, Professor Rumble, always said that you can't get harmony out of oatmeal," tee-heed Flossie, taking a slant at Mrs. Snickers. "I wish you'd whistle instead of trying to sing, Mr. Sweeney," chirped Mrs. Snickers from the corner of the room where she was trying to extract a few tears from the latest sob book. I can't read with such a racket. If you don't know how to whistle, hum. And I wish Miss Hemp wouldn't strike the keys so hard. I'm afraid she'll put the piano out of tune." "No chance of doing that," answered Jeff. "Paderewski's grandfather did that long ago." "I'll have you understand, Mr. Sweeney," snapped the landlady, "that my piano is in perfect condition. Besides, I didn't agree to furnish a piano with room and board." "That's all right, Mrs. Snickers," retorted Jeff. "If you can prove that Miss Hemp has broken anything that isn't already smashed, I'll pay for it." "You said it," whispered Flossie. And so it went until the song was finally wedded to Flossie's best melodies, after which we dashed up to the camp. Chapter 4. Genius is Genius. "The old lady ought to put that piano in a glass case and hire a watchman," growled Jeff as soon as we landed in the room. "Can you imagine her kicking about anybody putting it out of tune? Why, if that thing could talk, I bet it would tell you all about the Battle of Yorktown." "Never mind, Jeff," I said soothingly. "You'll be able to buy a piano for yourself pretty soon." As Jeff disrobed for the night, he threw one of his shoes at the wall just out of peevishness. "Listen, Jeff," I pleaded. "Please don't get any more inspirations at 3 a.m. I'd like to get a little sleep tonight." "Can't be helped, Jim," he replied, pulling on a sock. "Genius is genius, you know, and it's liable to hit a fellow any time. Why, only the other day I was reading a book called Private Lives of the Old Music Masters, or Why Barbers Went Hungry, by Professor Rufus Halfoff, and believe me, Jim, those fellows used to compose songs at all hours of the day and night. Why, one chap named Harmonio Pepperino used to go without sleep for a week. Another guy, Sirius D. W. Flapdoodle, used to live on 3 soda crackers a day before he became rich and famous. Genius is a wonderful thing, Jim," he concluded, taking a slant at himself in the mirror. "But say, Jeff, why is it that inspiration don't come to a fellow in the daytime?" "I don't know, Jim. Maybe it's bashful or something." However, as I extinguished the light, I hoped that nothing would cause Jeff to leave the bed until morning. Chapter 5. Undoubtedly the Right Place. The following Sunday, Jeff and I decided to search around the neighborhood for somebody who knew something about music. "What will they soak me to arrange my song, do you know, Jim?" "No idea, Jeff. A couple of dollars ought to pay the bill." At 1861 Civil Avenue we spied a sign reading, "Professor Tra-la-lar-bang, Music Teacher." "Let's try him," Jeff suggested, leading the way up the stoop. An exceptionally pretty girl answered the bell, all of which made Jeff certain that the place was just what he was looking for. "Is the professor in?" asked Jeff, taking off his hat. "Oh, yes. Just step into the conservatory, and I'll inform Father that you have called," she replied, giving Jeff a charming smile. "I guess this is the right place, all right," he whispered as soon as the young lady departed. And when Jeff makes a remark like that about a lady, why, said lady must be a considerable looker, because if there ever was a misogynist, Jeff was it. The professor turned out to be a short, heavy-set man of middle age, with just enough hair on his head to keep about 3 teeth of a comb in active service. "I think your song is marvelous," he told Jeff after trying Flossie's notes on the piano. "Thanks," returned Jeff, flushed. "How much will you charge to arrange it?" "Well, now, considering the fact that you are not a wealthy man, I should think that $10 would be a fair price." The professor turned an innocent-looking face upon Jeff and ran his fingers through at least 3 of his half a dozen hairs. Jeff gasped. Ditto yours truly. "What will we do about it, Jim?" he asked, scratching his ear. "Let the professor go ahead and arrange it," I replied, figuring that if the song turned out to be a hit, a little thing like 10 bones would be a mere nothing. "All right, Professor, go to it," said Jeff. "When will it be finished?" "I'll complete it by tomorrow night, and have my daughter deliver it to you," replied the professor as he led us to the door. As soon as we arrived home, Jeff got busy with his typewriter and started to hatch out some more song lyrics. I interrupted several times to ask how he was getting along, but for a reply he placed his finger to his lips, which meant that he was in deep concentration. Chapter 6. A Postponed Order. It is with a heavy heart that I record this chapter in the life of Jefferson Sweeney. although he finds consolation in the fact that great masters of literature like Rupert Blues, Governor Saab, and John Hendrick Byng had their ups and downs before buying villas on the Hudson. I refused to be cheered by the successes of less talented scribes than Jeff. However, he now admits that he made a slight mistake in supposing that all publishers were capable of recognizing genius as soon as it poked its head above the horizon of a mediocre world. It had cost him $10, of my money, to have Professor Bang arrange the song, and when it drifted back after 2 weeks from the first publisher to which he sent it, Jeff was as peeved as a hungry elephant after muffing a misdirected peanut. And when he had read the letter that accompanied its rejection, he dashed around the room like a Kansas cyclone out upon a practice spin. Here's the letter. Dear Mr. Sweeney, whatever the enclosed is supposed to be, we thank you for submitting the same. We publish songs, not riddles. It may interest you to learn that the 2 basic principles of popular songs are as follows. First, words. Second, music. Since your effort lacks both those essential features, we are obliged to return it to you. Very truly, Bow Fiddle and String, by Delancey Guff. Rather sarcastic. Anent this affair, Jeff commented as follows. Believe me, Jim, those fellows must have glass eyes and wooden heads. Why, they don't know song hits when they see them. I'll leave it to anybody with a spoonful of brains to judge whether or not my stuff isn't far ahead of those regular writers. Flossie, of course, was heartbroken over the whole business. She had left a deposit on a new gown at Madame de Murphy's Maison Parisienne, with full expectations of paying the balance from the proceeds of the songs. However, as soon as Flossie was apprised of the sad news, she immediately asked Madame to hold the gown for a few days more. Chapter 7. A Brilliant Plan. Listen, Jim, Jeff said later in a calmer manner. I've decided to change my name. Maybe they think that a fellow with a name like mine can't write songs. Do names count, Jeff? I inquired, wondering if it was so. I should say they do. That's why I'm going to take one of those hide-and-seek names myself. Just look at the fancy names on the songs and novels. To make sure that he would adopt a fitting name, Jeff delved into a volume entitled Aristocrats of the Old World, or Who Used to Be Who, by Baron Deliverus Lightnob. Due to the fact that he found such a vast assortment of noble-sounding names, he cogitated long and ponderously before making a selection. I guess Algernon St. Cyr just about fits my talent, he decided, throwing the book upon the bureau. Sounds rather elite and distinctive, I affirmed, and it surely did. Jeff sent out the song again, this time to the Jazzerino Music Company, and the name of the author and composer was not Jefferson Sweeney now, but Algernon St. Cyr. But the title remained the same, When Pitcher McCarthy Hit Casey on the Bean. Chapter 8. Prunes on the Side. A week passed, during which time Jeff gave his brain a much-needed rest by staying as far away from the camp as possible. He would tramp the streets for hours at a time with a notebook in hand, jotting down anything that impressed him as being good song material. He had visions of Ava Tangleway, Grace Ledoux, and Harry Lauder singing his song gem before great and enthusiastic audiences. Flossie, in turn, cared nothing for fame and less for the applause of the multitudes. But that gown, would Madame de Murphy wait just a little longer? She would. Flossie's anxiety was caused more or less by the rapidly approaching ball to be given by the Big Noise Social Club, of which she was an honorary member. And maybe she wouldn't make Tilly giggle jealous when that glove-counter expert piped her new regalia. Well. And then a few days more of anxious waiting, a little more anticipation, and the world was theirs. The sun shone, the birds sang, and the moon beamed, just for Flossie and Jeff. Soon as I had arrived home from work, accompanied by a certain amount of grease and grime, I was apprised of the glad news. The song was bought and paid for. Not a word was enclosed with the $50 check. Just pay to the order of Algernon St. Cyr, etc. "Letters don't count, Jim," Jeff informed me, "although the price paid for my song is pretty low. It's all right for a starter. Anyway, it proves that there is at least one publisher in the country with brains enough to appreciate a song hit when he sees it." As soon as Mrs. Snickers had cashed the check, Jeff gave Flossie her share, and that young lady immediately dashed out and brought back the cherished gown, much to the admiration of the landlady. "Ain't it just gorgeous?" she asked the assembled company, displaying her heart's desire. "It looks great, Miss Hemp, great," chirped Jeff. "Stick to me and you'll soon be owning motors and yachts." Much joy in the house that night. The landlady even went so far as to give us an extra portion of prunes, and enough butter to cover sufficiently at least 3 slices of bread. Jeff was obliged to admit that she could be human if she tried. That night Jeff slept as calmly as Rip Van Winkle was supposed to have slept. Not a murmur, not a twist, not a sign of restlessness was noticeable during the entire slumber period. Chapter 9. Business Skill. The following morning a slight tap on the door was accompanied by a letter that Mrs. Snickers slipped under the crack. Jeff was the first to read it, and then, bang, like a bolt from the sky, his hopes and dreams were dashed to oblivion. Luck, apparently, was not twin to genius, or even a distant relation. Here's the letter. Mr. Algernon St. Cyr, 13 Luck Avenue, Clevelado, Calachusetts. Dear Sir, recently we sent you our check for $50. In doing this, our bookkeeper, in a manner that is still puzzling us, made a grievous mistake. Check should have been sent to another person. Be kind enough to rectify his error by returning the aforementioned sum as soon as convenient. Your song is under consideration. Yours truly, Jazzerino Music Company, by Octavio Flat. Well, maybe Jeff wasn't peeved. Boy! He ran his fingers through his own wealth of red hair in a manner that betokened no great love for a certain music publisher. "Believe me, Jim, this world is all wrong," he complained. "How does that goop expect me to return money that I already spent? Can they have me arrested?" he suddenly asked, his face turning from a red to a whitish hue. "I don't know, Jeff," I replied, not knowing anything about the law on that point. Jeff, for the next few minutes, paced around the room like a caged wild cat, and then, getting a sudden inspiration, exclaimed, "I'm going to take a chance, Jim. I'll teach those birds a lesson, take it from me." He dashed over to the typewriter and yanked off the cover. His face regaining its fiery color, Jeff proceeded to assault that innocent piece of mechanism in an extremely vicious manner. He walloped the commas, banged the semicolons, and pounded the periods. "Take a slant at this, Jim," he said, passing me the following letter. Mr. Octavio Flat, care of Jazzerino Music Company, Bedlam, Orifornia. My dear Mr. Flat, you said it. Take it from me, mistake is the correct word. If you can show me how to return money that I've already spent, you might have a chance of getting back your coin. Hereafter, count your change before leaving the post box, and give my regards to the bookkeeper. He's my idea of a regular guy. And listen, since my song is paid for, why not publish it? Yours seriously, Algernon St. Cyr. Believe me, Jim, they've got to publish my song now. And Algernon St. Cyr, nay, Jefferson Sweeney, smiled triumphantly. He considered himself a businessman as well as a genius, a bird that does not occur in many regions. End of Words and Music.